Do you suppose he didn't know what he was doing? Or knew what he was doing and didn't want anyone to know?
I think that he knew what he was doing, but he didn't want to know what he was doing.
Well, in a very real sense, that's what we're all doing. Because even though we might think we knew, the thing will only come to life for someone else when he knows something that we don't know.
What were the questions about Varese like that I asked you?
I just want to know what about Varese.
I was thinking about that since the last time we spoke here. Especially, you remember about changing one's mind. In fact, that seemed to be my dinner conversation for the past 3 weeks. You remember that Varese, his contribution does not seem as important as Weber, because he didn't change our minds as Weber did. I'm just mentioning it. I don't know if I want to pursue it.
What about...
I mean, it doesn't really has to do with Varese or Weber, but it has to do with the way we think in general,
yes.
and the way we're influenced by other things.
Yes. What you mentioned in connection with the loud sounds in some of your early music, that they seem to require something to be done, had some implications with regard to energy.
Yes.
How do you relate what seems apparent to me, the a fantastic energy in Varese's music with with those vertical structures? How do you think about that?
I wouldn't exactly use the word energy, John. I would say that the whole vertical thinking becomes extremely saturated and then attaches itself to the signals, the motivic element that we hear. I don't think that it was the motivic element that suggested or went along concurrently.
It comes out of the structure rather than producing it.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's like energy escaping, and the energy itself is in reservoir.
Yes. Notice that he doesn't get involved with, for example, making a very complicated, say, thematic situation. He tries to keep it level, even in times of invention.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way I hear it, at least.
And this brings it about that, as in Satie, but for other reasons, entirely novel events can take place. That have no motivic preparation, are not even in the sense of Schoenberg far removed, but are rather simply different. I'm thinking of those chimes toward the end of ionization. It's as though isn't it as though it must be as though another structure
Yes.
come into existence?
It's interesting. I think, the cadences of composers are very revealing. Maybe because they feel that the piece is over. Or if they're using, say, a text. I picked up your book on Virgil Thompson the other day in the bookstore, and I read through most of it. You mentioned that about Thompson's music.
Yes.
Remember how he was following this particular text concerning an anvil. Was it out of Blake? I don't remember.
Yes, the piece called Tiger, Tiger.
Yes. And how Varesian.
Yes, the first version.
And there were some remarkable cadences of Purcell's where he does just splendid things only because the piece has ended. That was always very interesting to me, how on one hand the detractors of our music would talk about the wonders of absolute music, and then if you would go into the whole literature of absolute music, you find that there's very little of that music that's absolutely absolute. How dependent most music is, say, on a literary element. That always struck me true about Boulez's whole career, that the literary element seemed to suggest this absolute music. The early piano sonatas, how he was involved, say, with Artaud.
Oh, certainly. Mallarmé.
And then Mallarmé, or René Char.
René Char, yes.
And this could be very true, say, of Stravinsky, of many.
Oh, and there's an article of Boulez that I've referred to sometimes, where he speaks of all the devices of syntax, of punctuation and parentheses and so forth, and the desirability of introducing such practices into music.
When did he write that article?
I don't know exactly, but I think it's before 54.
Then it's before Contacta.
I think so. This closeness to literature also took place in the music of Adolf Weiss, with whom I studied. And his rhythm of much of his early music was taken from, I believe, poetry of Walt Whitman.
I find that all over. In fact, an Israeli composer, serial composer, visited me, and he showed me that his rhythm was based on some medieval Hebrew poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And just the other day, a student of mine told me that I don't know how it came up, but that he heard Della Piccolo at a lecture some years ago in Philadelphia, where Della Piccolo talked mainly about Joyce. and its relation to music. So I never really understood what they meant by absolute music. You know something? I think that you're one of the few composers that absolutely writes absolute music.
And it seems so theatrical. Mm.
Well, you know what happened when they tried to really write absolute music? You know, it all began to sound like Paganini. But then they got involved. Then they got involved with the instrumental devices. I mean, even, say, Beethoven's Grosse Fugue, which is one of his monumental works, is actually an impassioned hymn to God, you know. It's a march. What pieces of yours are they going to play in Cincinnati?
Shortly, they're playing, the LaSalle String Quartet's playing my string quartet from 1950. Which reminds me, I heard recently in Urbana a recording of that piece of mine you must remember, Concerto for Prepared Piano and Orchestra.
Yes.
That was done at Cooper Union
Yes.
once. And
Was this that performance?
no, another performance. They had done it with students at the University of Illinois, and they'd spent several months putting it together. Whereas you remember at Cooper Union, I think 15 minutes were taken by the union musicians, and most of those minutes were spent laughing at what they were obliged to do. So that I had never really heard the piece, and all these years I've thought of it as something that I'd avoid hearing. And when I was in Urbana, John Garvey, who had conducted it, spent 5 days trying to persuade me to come and listen to the recording. Finally, on the 5th day, I had nothing better to do. And I listened to it, and I was surprised. The piece is quite extraordinarily interesting in this sense that it each sound, each thing that happens is that nothing that precedes it prepares you for the experience. So that I think even if you were not interested, that you would become interested at some point. And a very curious thing happened at the very end of the piece. The audience burst into laughter.
At the end?
At the very end, but there was no way of knowing that it was the end. Because, you know, the third movement has long silences in it. And out of these silences there comes some sound, and then another silence, and then some more sound. And I don't know just what it was that made them laugh. It may have been something they saw, some way of performing on an instrument. But it must have been very strange for them to laugh and then realized that they had produced, so to speak, the cadence of a situation that really didn't have one.
John, may I ask you a question?
Yes.
Why do you continue to compose?
Well, I have 2 pieces to write now because I've been asked to do them. I think that had I not been asked, well, I know that if I had not been asked, I wouldn't write these particular pieces. But having been asked and having said that I would, I will do it. And I'm sure that once I get involved in them, I'll enjoy it. What they will be, I don't know. I mentioned to you the last time we talked that about writing for harpsichord.
Yes.
And that business of the scales and so
Yes.
forth. And the more I think of it, the more ridiculous it seems.
I wasn't trying to push you in the corner, by asking that question.
Yeah.
I mean, I asked it with love.
Yeah.
Because...
No, I would really be inclined not to write.
Because I'll tell you, I mean, a long time ago, I didn't feel that I was making anything. I didn't have that feeling that I was making anything. Consequently, I was very happy. And then, now, with the possibilities of hearing my music, it becomes obvious that I made something.
Mm.
And it has left me very unhappy. And it's as if I'm in a state now where I have this burden, this psychological burden of making something. You know what I mean?
Mm.
And it's a very unhappy burden.
But that's only the case when you're thinking about it. When you were talking a little bit earlier about the piece which you're writing now, it didn't sound like a burden at all. It sounded like an experience full of wonder. The way you were talking about the woodwinds, wasn't it?
Yes.
And the fact that they might begin it when the structure was completed. It didn't sound like you were talking about a burden. When you think about it, then it could be a burden. But when you're doing it, I don't think it is.
Well, then let me put it this way, that as you get older, you develop a certain consciousness that you could fall on your face in some way. And I'll put it again another way. Last year, Leon Kirshner asked me to speak to his composition class at Harvard. And when I went in, I looked at them and I said, how many here know how to write a bad piece? And nobody knew anymore how to write a bad piece. They didn't know how to write badly. They all knew how to make pieces. Oh, I suppose what's really troubling me is this thing that I think has come up in all our talks, this whole business of being in the world. This whole business of naming it. You have to name it. You know that marvelous myth of Ixion? That's why, in a sense, I was aware of that when I wrote Ixion for Summer Space.
Yes.
Where this man has a very beautiful horse, and he didn't want anybody to steal it. This is one of the myths of Ixion. And so he decided that he wasn't going to give it a name. Zeus saw the horse and stole it. So Ixion ran all over the place looking for the horse, but he couldn't call it, you see. It had no name. That's the basis of the story. Ixion got involved in other adventures, but that's the basis of the story. And there is something about not being in the world where what you do is not named.
It's quite marvelous. It reminds me of something that happened recently. Two students at the University of Cincinnati came to talk with me. They're nearly doctors of music. They're graduate students. Walter Levine of the LaSalle String Quartet told me that they were extremely well schooled and that they had earned the right to enjoy music. People have told me, I've just gone to Cincinnati, but they've told me that the city is very conservative, and yet everyone I talk to is interested in new ideas. And I didn't know quite what to expect when these two students came. They're 25 years old. They told me, among other things, that the university had access to a fund to buy musical scores, and that they had been extremely pleased to get a score from Europe which had some novel notation for which there was no explanation. I think of this in relation to your no names. They were delighted with being in a situation where they didn't know what they were dealing with, and yet could find a way to do it. It's like those, the pleasure we obtain now from aquariums, where the fish no longer have Latin names.
This is true.
Yes.
Now we can eat them.
Or we can look at them.
You can't eat a fish with a Latin name. That's very interesting.
All the fish swim together now in one large tank. And the public, the tank is made of glass, and the public walk around and see the fish at all the various levels, with no explanation of what they're looking at. Formerly, you could read the Latin and then move on. Or you could say, for instance, of a piece of music that was G sharp.
And not hear it.
And not hear it.
Well, I think this leads us into a very interesting idea. You know, if a student brings some type of graphic situation to me, and you know, most of them now, the directions are at least 3 or 4 pages of what they can do, what they could do,
Yes.
what they are doing. I always told them that I always felt that it should be implicit in the score.
Either that, or if you're going to have notes of explanation, I think the notes should have at least some of the ambiguity of poetry, so that one wouldn't know exactly what they meant. In order that reading them, the reader would somehow come to life and be in a position to deal with the music. It's a far cry from notation as a blueprint and a way of measuring whether something has been done correctly or not.
You know, it's interesting in recent years that you read an article in some scholarly magazine finally admitting to the inadequacy of conventional notation. But I always felt that your work was really not involved with creating a new notation, but getting something as close to the action or the experience of how this person should react to the sounds.
I hope so. At least when I made changes in notation, it hasn't been to well, it's been because I was obliged to. If it could have been done with the conventional notation, I would have done that.
It's a shame that most musicians think of the conventional notation as the, you know, in terms of language, that it became almost like a language thing for them that they were protecting. Yet you would think that the whole idea of music was to present the thing in such a straight and direct way that they then could go ahead and do what they're doing, you know. And so in a sense, their whole defense of the notation had nothing to do with making music, but had to do with the notation.
Oh, there have been so many problems. You remember that interesting one with again this piece of yours that that Merce Cunningham used, Ixion, where it was written on graph and used numbers, and that was the piece, of course, and that was the way to read it. But through the exigencies of rehearsals and so forth, I translated it into something conventional with quarter notes, you remember, which was not what the piece was, but which permitted the musicians to quickly play it, where the numbers meant that they would have had to devote themselves in a way that they actually didn't have the time or inclination to do. A similar problem arose with that beautiful piece that Christian Wolff wrote for Rune of Merce Cunningham, where again the original notation, which of course was the piece and the way to read it, was not the way that it was presented to the musicians, but translated so that they'd be able to do it quickly without giving it too much thought. But times are changing, and I think in both cases now that large numbers of musicians would be able to read the notation which you on the one hand wrote and Christian on the other wrote, without that crutch, which in each case I gave them.
John, do you have any time these days to look at painting as much as you used to?
I take time. Like yesterday and the day before, I was at Brandeis University, and the new theater there, the Spingold Theater, is right next to the Rose Art Museum, where William Sykes is curator now. And I saw two shows, one of a collection belonging to the museum of paintings, and then downstairs there was a very interesting show of photography of the American social scene as seen by 12 photographers. I saw some painting too in Cincinnati recently in a private home, quite a number of Alber's work and a Picabia.
How about the young people? Have you seen any of their work in Cincinnati?
Not yet. I'm sure I will, though. And generally when I go to a university, at some point or another, I go through the art department.
You know, it's interesting how so many artists today, when they make constructions and such, how they would incorporate sound. And the thought occurred to me recently, would I ever think of incorporating structures?
Mm.
And I wonder why they felt completely relaxed in using sound when I feel completely foreign from, say, making
Yes.
something.
But in those classes that I had at the New School in the 50s, which consisted largely of the students making compositions, I insisted that they make things that we ourselves could perform in the small room where the class was. And one of the first to bring something was Alan Caprow, And he came in with cloth and all sorts of things and objects in terms of time, performance in time. I mean to say, one could do it and be relaxed about doing it.
Did it ever enter your head?
Oh, I think so. Certainly not as it would enter yours, though. It'd be marvelous if you do that. Beautiful. Let me know when the performance is. How marvelous.
Because, one can very well think of all kinds of structural schemes where you would want what hanging from what and where a sound should be.
Beautiful.
Other than the conventional
Right.
space that you use.
Marvelous.
And I was thinking about it. I'll never do it, but...
Oh, please do it.
Well, if I did do it, I would have to have somebody help me with it. I can't handle it.
Well, that's the way things get done nowadays. You can observe that when things are done by one person now, they encounter obstacles. But if you get many people working together, the obstacles tend to disappear. Of course, they could crop up in another way, but they would be more apt to disappear. And this would be a way of turning society not into something that would give you a feeling of burden with respect to your own work, but would be a way of transforming that whole ogre into something extremely pleasing. In other words, as you were saying, that you have done something now makes it perfectly practical in this society that what you have to do can be used. Now you can return the compliment to society by requiring them to help you to do what it is that you want done.
Certainly life seems to be leading us there. This isolation I was talking about, this burden, this individuality, now seems to be pointless. I said seems to be. I wonder if I really believe that.
You remember what Bill de Kooning said years and years ago, that tragedy was gone, that the miserable circumstances that someone got into were simply pathetic. I was extremely interested, too, in this history of economics that I'm reading now, to see that the social misery that took place in the large numbers of people who suffered or were killed in moving from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance through that great social change. far worse than we've yet seen. And just today, before I came here, something in the atmosphere in New York, there was a I don't know if it's just in my mind or whether it's in the city. I rather think the two things go together. But there's an atmosphere of violence, danger,